Hello and welcome to Barn Blog Solo, and today we're going to do the kind of post that I used to do over at Nailing It Down. But I wanted to get into this because it comes up a lot, and there's a lot of distinctions around this when you talk about what is meant in classical socialist writings by the term proletariat. The term proletariat comes from proletariat. We're going to get into where that is too. Clearly, it's Latin. But I wanted to thank Matt Huber for writing me and reminding me about this. He was listening to my Samir Amin talk where I mentioned in Capital Volume 3, in the last chapter on classes, it breaks off before proper definitions are given. Matt reminds me that there is a section in Capital Volume 1, and we're going to stick with the Penguin editions for this, even though I like the new translation. I just think I know the pagination better and more people still have this older one. There's a footnote where Karl Marx deduces from his Wage, Labor, and Capital pamphlet a definition of proletariat. But it's not unproblematic when we get to certain things that are debated within the proletariat and why we don't have the definition in Capital Volume 3. So, holding this upside down, we're going to talk about it today. Proletariat were a social class of Roman citizens who had little to no property. Property here was defined as owning more than 1,100 asses. Asses or asserii were bronze coins, kind of like a predecessor to a penny. And they were categorized this way for military service. Their children are proles, offspring, were listed on the census instead of their property. So the proletarias, and proletariat in plural, were the producers of offspring who could be recruited for the army, but they couldn't really do contemporary military service because military service at higher levels were persons who own their own horses or their own arms and fought without payment for the Commonwealth. But the military contribution of a proletariat was children as foot troops. Proletariat was also called capite censi, or head count, persons who were registered not as to their property, but existing as individuals, as the head of a familius, caput of a family. Now, the proletariat in the Century Assembly were the lowest classes, and they were largely, although not completely, deprived of voting rights. Since voting was weighed based on social hierarchy, a majority could be reached before the proletariat were ever asked to vote, and the proletariat were only ever asked to vote in situations where there was no large consensus. And that includes the fact that the opinions of the elites are weighted more heavily. So in this way, the proletariat in ancient Rome were what we might say semi-disenfranchised or mostly disenfranchised. So they have very little investment in either the property regime or the governmental regime. Of the state, but they weren't totally outside of it. All right. The proletariat could be asked to vote if there was a split in elite and higher class opinion, for example. So it was sort of like the general population breaks the tie between the elite, which is not formally how we work today, but let's be honest, not far from it. Thus the proletariat and how they were used in ancient Rome. Like many things in the classical liberal period, the use of proletariat as a metaphor comes out of the early modern period that we might call the Renaissance in Europe, where we were looking back at early Republican and imperial documents from classical antiquity, quote unquote, particularly in Western Europe. And this led a lot of Western liberal scholars to point out that the industrial worker and the proletariat had similar conditions. One of the first people to do so in 1807 was political science and philosopher Hugues Félicité Robert de Laminius, who wrote a book on the conditions of what we might call early industrial labor that was translated into English as modern slavery. The Swiss economist and historian Jean-Charles Léonard de Simony actually applied the term proletariat to most of the working classes under capital. And it was Sismondi that Marx actually gets the term from and cited the most. But Marx worked dialectically, and this actually leads us to think about this pretty concretely. We have to remember Marx, who was classically educated at the Friedrich Wilhelm University of Berlin, in addition to studying Hegelian philosophy and Epicureanism, also studied Roman law. So he was well aware of the Roman constitutional structure. Marx defined the proletariat as people who had no significant ownership of the means of production and whose only subsistence is to sell their labor power for wage labor or slavery. And we get that in capital volume for wage labor or a salary, not slavery. Slaves are a different category, thus making them variable capital for the capitalist, both their labor power as something alienated for themselves as something traded on the capital market, but something that can be more easily exploited and variable due to social conditions and the change of social and necessary labor time, etc., than fixed capital, such as the cost of maintaining machines at market rate. Now, let's go into what Marx actually defines this as. Now, Marx claims in his own footnote here, and you will find this footnote if you're looking at the English edition, in the chapter on the general law of accumulation, that is 764 in the English translation. This is the translation made by Folks and introduced by Ernst Mandel, what we consider the Penguin Classic. Karl Marx, Wage and Wage Labor, Cited. You can find this pamphlet reprinted in Karl Marx Selected Works, Volume 1, page 162. Quote, this starts off with a quotation from Collins, L'Économie Politique. If the masses are at all oppressed equally, the more proletarian a country has, the richer it will be. Collins, L'Économie Politique, Sources de Révolution et de Utopium Prétendes Socialistes, Paris, 1875, Volume 3, page 331. Proletarian must be understood to mean, economically speaking, nothing other than wage laborer, the man who produces and valorizes capital, and is thrown onto the street as soon as he becomes superfluous to the need of the valorization process by mons or capital. As Pecqueur called this person, the sickly proletariat of the primitive forest is a pretty Rochesterfian fancy. The primitive foreigner is the owner of the primitive forest and uses it as his property, meaning as few obstacles to this as an orangutan. He is not, therefore, a proletarian. This would only be the case if the primitive forest exploited him instead of being exploited by him. And as far as his health is concerned, such a man will bear comparison not only to the modern proletariat, but also with the syphilitic and superfluous quantity. However, Herr Wilhelm Rocher no doubt means his native breath of Lungsburg when he talks about the primitive forest. So, typical Marx burn. But what we see here is still an ambiguity in this definition, and it's an ambiguity that is off debated, and we'll get into why. Marx says that the proletarian is nothing other than a wage laborer, but then it also says productive to capital, meaning productive to capital surplus. In volume 2, I don't have it out, and I'm not going to pull up the exact quotation, and in parts of volume 1, Marx mentions the teacher and the sausage maker as both productive to capital surplus. Capital productivity for Marx is not about making physical commodities alone. It is about generating value, aka abstract value or surplus value, by being able to sell things on the market, whether what you're selling is a service, a physical commodity, or the access to a service or a physical commodity through things like future shares. Marx knows about them. He understands this. Now, it's a little bit ambiguous about this, but in fact, he talks specifically about the teacher as a model for this. The teacher who works for the state is not generating productivity because they are living off of tax revenues. The teacher who works for a private corporation is generating profits, and it's thus productive. Blue and white collar distinctions are irrelevant here, although Marx does realize they exist. The ambiguity then is the wage laborer always a proletariat, or only when the wage laborer is productive to capital surplus? We hope to get an answer from that from Marx, but we don't. And then I'll get into things that developed in Maoism, because this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we're going to just read the entire last chapter of Capital Volume 3, because it's not even a page and a half long. And again, I'm referring to the Penguin Classics edition. Like most people, you can tell I've read Capital Volume 3 slightly less than Capital Volume 1. It has one crease as opposed to my Capital Volume 1, which is pretty beat up. But let's get into this. This is the aforementioned chapter that doesn't give us the answer. Chapter 52, page 1025 in the Penguin Classic edition of Capital Volume 3. And there is, as of yet, no new translation better than this one to reference. Quote, "The owners of mere labor power, the owners of capital, and the landowners whose respective sources of income are wages, profits, and ground rent, in other words, the wage laborers, the capitalists, and the landowners, form the three great classes of modern society based on the capitalist mode of production. It is undeniably in England that it is the modern society in its economic articulation is most widely and most classically developed. Even here, though, this class articulation does not emerge in pure form." This is an important thing. "Here, too, middle and transitional levels always conceal the boundaries, although in comparatively less so than in the countryside than in the towns. We have seen how it is the constant tendency and law of development of the capitalist mode of production to divorce the means of production ever more from laborer and to concentrate the fragmented means of production more and more into larger groups, to transform the laborer into the wage laborer and the means of production into capital. And this tendency also corresponds to the independent divorce of all landed property from capital and labor, and the transformation of all landed property into the form of landed property corresponding to the capitalist mode of production." We have a footnote too. F. List observes correctly, "The predominance of the owner-manager on the large estate simply indicates inadequate civilization, meaning communication, local industry, and wealthy cities. This is why we find it all over Russia, Poland, Hungary, and Mecklenburg. It is formerly predominant in England too, but with the arrival of trade and industry, these estates were broken up into middle-sized farms and leased out. Die Ackerfassung der Zweirwirtschaft und der Auswanderung." 1852, page 10. Another asterisk, this is from the editor. "Friedrich List, the most important German economist of the first half of the 19th century, closely represented the demands of the embryotic industrial bourgeoisie in Germany, and is particularly remembered for his forceful argument for the protective tariffs." Something Marx actually wasn't a big fan of, but anyway. The question to be answered next is, quote, "What makes a class?" And this arises automatically from answering another question. What makes wage laborers, capitalists, and landowners the formative elements of the three great social classes? At first sight, the identity of revenues and revenue sources, For these individuals are the three great social groups where components, the individual forming them, live respectively from wages, profits, and ground rents. From the valorization of the labor power, capital, and landed property. From this point of view, however, doctors and government officials would also form two classes, as they belong to two distinct social groups, the revenue of each group flowing from its own source. The same would hold true for the infinite fragmentation of interests and positions within the divisions of the social laborer, splits not only the workers, but also the capitalists and landowners. The latter, for instance, into vineyard holders, field holders, forest holders, mine owners, etc., etc. At this point, the manuscript breaks off, Frederick Engels, and we don't get an answer as to what makes the class. So the only thing we have is this footnote that is supposedly a gloss on wage, labor, and capital in Capital Volume 1. But that footnote has the ambiguity, as I mentioned, of saying that the proletariat is just a wage laborer, but also the wage labor productive to capital, as if there are no other forms of wage labor, which is largely not true, and Marx knows it. Marx writes about this in Capitals Volume 2 and 3 and in Theories of Surplus Value extensively. But also his examples mean that we're not dealing just with physical commodity production or building bricks or something like that. And also it is very clear in mocking the yeoman that small petty proprietors, be they landholding peasants, yeomen, farmers, or small capital holders who have less than one employee, do not count as proletarian, even if they live off of their own physical labor and thus are very close to them. Now, the reason why proletarian was an important category for Marx that he pulled from Sismondi and tried to develop himself and all his political and economic writings is that they have the skills to reproduce modern production and thus reproduce civilization, but they have no investment since all they have is their labor power. They don't have any property. We see a continuity from the propertyless definition in ancient Rome, but we also see distinctions. Are proletarians who work in unproductive sectors, like the state, not proletarians? Are they just wage earners? Well, that isn't answered in either case. And so it's highly debated today amongst Marxists. People will try to assume that it is clear that it is about productivity because productivity implies exploitation. But that's not the only criterion, remember, that we're concerned with. Exploitation is one Marxist category that explains the difference between, say, wage earning and classical chattel slavery. But it is also interesting to deal with other things that come up. So Marx talks about the petty bourgeoisie, such as small shopkeepers, as having an income comparable to an ordinary wage. This is still true. Look at the bodega owner. But with different interests because their interests are invested into property in those current relations. And then he cuts in the other direction with the rag proletariat, or the Lumpenproletarian, lumpen means rag, which is a, quote, retrograde class or a social category. It's unclear if we should call it a class or not, because there's not one relation of production that dominates the list that Marx gives us of who makes up the lumpen. And in Marx's letters, as pointed out by the scholar Clyde Barrow, there's also pretty big distinctions on true lumpen and lumpen so-called, who were service workers, who were seasonal. So there was big debates by socialist parties if people should organize the informal proletariat, who are close to the Lumpenproletariat. But it's hard to see that formality or informality of wage relations would be defining, because even at the time period Marx is writing about in Capital Volume 1, most even proletarian labor is not, properly speaking, formal economic trade. That people are day workers and whatnot. So socialist parties argued over if service workers and informal economy counted as Lumpenproletariat in the Second International. It was a big debate. The other thing that came up, and this is huge to deal with proletarian, it's not just a productive or unproductive wage earner problem, and not just the relation to the lumpen and what the lumpen really are problem. Because, for example, entertainers, beggars, tricksters, buskers, criminals, and prostitutes aren't all doing the same thing as some of the people who get categorized as lumpen. Now, I actually myself have modified Marxist traits here because I can't find anything consistent in Lumpenproletariat that is often just about this or that. And there's two theories as to lumpen in Marx. One theory is that it's the lower order of the proletariat that is outside of the informal economy. So you get that from the list. The other theory is that it's the detritus of all social classes who have to survive off of informal and non-legal exploitation, such as begging, thievery, criminality, etc. But again, entertainers being listed here is an interesting dilemma. Since again, there's nothing inherently different between an entertainer and as a teacher in the way it produces surplus capital. So then the question was, is the lumpen just a detritus of prior social classes who don't have a place in society, or is it the lowest form of the proletarian order? I mean, Marx in some ways implies both, although if we are honest, he only says the detritus part. So this led to a debate in the socialist parties, which led to a debate around productivity. I apologize about that. New wealth is created by labor applied to national resources, but both national resources and labor are means of wealth. And that's important. Marx makes this distinction in Critique of the Goethe program. You don't have to work to have the wealth. You have to work to valorize it. But we can get back here and talk about what that means. Now, during the 20th century, after Lenin came up with the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasant, and people like Lukács started focusing on the distinction between the proletariat for itself and the proletariat in itself, a distinction Marx makes, this idea that class consciousness was actually the defining element of proletarianization, not one social position or relation to production, began to emerge a lot, particularly in the Chinese Communist Revolution. So proletariat was a proletariat class consciousness developed through a subjective standpoint with proper education, which was provided, of course, by the Chinese Communist Party, thus enabling the proletariat to be for itself. But you can see the problem here. If the ideas of proletarian wholes is more important than their social position, how is this materialist at all? And two, it also means you can exclude things that you don't like in various wage laboring classes as being non-proletarian as a way not to deal with it. Furthermore, what the class consciousness content should be, and Lukács was circular, that they'd had a successful revolution. But once you've had a successful revolution, this leads to all kinds of problems and debates about who the proletarian is. Part of the problem is that the industrial proletarian was a collective imago of the all proletarian relations in the 19th and early 20th century, and was what Marx focused on. But both in Russia and in China, industrial proletarianity, to use a weird word that I just made up, existed but was not predominant at all, and most of the members of the Communist Party didn't come from that class anyway. In the conception of the Chinese Communist Party, most of the original membership came from the peasantry and some urban workers. So a redefinition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasant being essentially the dictatorship of the proletariat, as is asserted in the 1982 Chinese Constitution, which people should read, by the way. It's a very interesting document, and it's hard to actually square with some things in official statements by Xi about socialism. But anyway, which is not to say Xi isn't being consistent. It's actually just interesting because, for example, you'll hear Xi say that we're going to achieve socialist monetization or achieve socialism by 2050, and that's going to really kick off by 2035. But in the Constitution of 1982, and specifically only that one, but it's a constitution still acting in China. China is said had gone through its period of democracy and it entered its socialist period. But there may be ambiguities in those statements that aren't getting translated into English, and I don't speak Mandarin well enough to know if there's modifiers or implications beyond the obvious. Anyway, but with this amount of peasantry and this focus on the dictatorship of the proletariat being the same as the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasant, they had to redefine what proletarian was using this for itself and its stuff distinction and using the for itself argument. Now, when you completely bracket out the socialist relations, and against it being, like I said, probably idealist in my mind, the other thing is you can pretty much say proletarian is what you want it to be. And you can go with a politics first thing removed from any proletarian movement or proletarian culture by speaking that you and not the proletariat in itself speak for the proletariat for itself, and you know what it is. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the reason why this even happened was that the proletarian revolutions did not actually happen in places where the industrial proletariat was predominant, and the entire late 20th century crisis of Marxism and reestablishment of Marxism and focus on nations, etc., emerges out of this contradiction. But it also gets back to the fact that we still haven't dealt with what if the proletariat has to be productive to capital, because Marxist definitions, we don't get one in Capital Volume 3, and the only one we get in Capital Volume 1 is in a footnote that implies both, that all wage laborers are proletariat, but it's because they are productive to capital surplus. Thus, that ambiguity remains unresolved, and all these other questions flow from it. So what is proletariat? Well, we know that proletariat has to be a wage laborer without capital property. We say capital property because just like the proletariat in ancient Rome did actually have property. They could have up to, 1,100 esse, but they don't have enough property to be productive. So their bodies and their offspring are what counts as a legal category. And that's what we're talking about here. Now, productive capital is not your home. If you own a home and you have to live in it and you can't rent it out, you're not holding it for ground rents. It might have speculative value to you for getting loans and stuff, but that may not be valorizable. It could be fictitious capital. You might have $300,000 of value from a house one day, and then the market collapse, which is one of the reasons why people care so much about property values and when they enter the property market in America. But that is not really productive property unless you have enough wealth to buy more than one house. And as Marx says, in the cases, even in England, where capitalism must advance, the capital classes didn't exist in pure forms. He does make that absolutely clear in Volume 3, but as to what that means and what the distinctions really are, other than the broad dependence on wage labor, the broad dependence on capital ownership, and the broad dependence on ground rents, specifically ground rents and not other forms of rents, then we don't have great distinctions here. Also, the landlord and the capitalist are always listed together and also separate because they obviously interrelate to one another often and always. So Marx was well aware that even in his key paradigmatic examples, the waters were muddied even in the 19th century. Today, they're even more muddied, and hence all debates around this. So, did Marx ever define proletarian? Yes, but he didn't solve the key debates in the definition. And when he went to do so in Capital Volume 3, he didn't finish it. So, there you go. I'll list my links for all these information in the show notes. Protect your peace. I like to thank all my patrons. You can become a patron for as little as $4. Inflation happened. I rose at $1. And get all the audio to everything on the YouTube and additional audio shows. If you want additional video shows, which you will get in audio form, but you pay for $6. And if you want to have more say in what I produce, or to have more say in behind the scenes content, or maybe even commission a patron only episode, you can join for $10 a month. Thank you. Have a great day. Protect your peace.